things that you can hear someone say to you is that you're a good for nothing. Maybe you've heard those words, I hope not. Maybe you've uttered those words. I'm sure maybe you've uttered those words when it comes to a tool, maybe in your garage or your shed, good for nothing. And there's probably a variety of ways to color that expression, good for nothing. But I imagine that uttering that to someone who is struggling can be one of the most devastating things that they could hear. To be told that you're just not good. Because the implications are, well, I'm bad. Am I bad at my core? If you pull away the peel around me, are you saying that it's just rot in there? That I'm useless? It's a very destructive thing to say to someone. The more poetic way that it's been said in the past is a ne'er-do-well. I think that's rather, you're a ne'er-do-well. It's fun to say, never do well, ne'er-do-well. And I was doing some reading about this phenomena that happened in the 1800s, quite frequently the late 1800s, the early 1900s, that if you had a child, an adult child, who was a ne'er-do-well, that you would send them away. Have you ever heard this term, the remittance man? I don't know if you can see it there. No, the word isn't there. Yeah, British remittance men in the Canadian West. So back in England, where one's social standing, I suppose like everywhere else, mattered, and the culture had not yet shifted from having multiple children to work on the farmland to city living, where perhaps you still had a number of children, and maybe there weren't enough jobs to go around. But if you had one of those children who might be considered lazy, who might be considered unwilling to lift their finger to do anything, who just was not motivated to seek gainful employment, but enjoyed simply sitting around daily at the corner pub, having a pint and staying out late with one's friends, if you considered you had a child who was a ne'er-do-well, then you would, for not just their sake, but for the reputation of one's own family, you would send them away. You would give them what we call today an allowance, but back then was called a remittance. You would give them a monthly remittance and you would send them away to one of the colonies, where one of two things would occur. They would either figure out how to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that the frontier lands would draw from them that natural instinct to work and to do something, or they would merely continue with the remittance to be a ne'er-do-well. It happened so many times that someone got around to writing a book about it simply in the Canadian West. Do any of you know any of those remittance men or those ne'er-do-wells? I do not, but I suspect that so many of those people who were sent because they were lazy, sent overseas, probably ended up being clergy. I don't know. So imagine what it would be like to be told by not just your parents, but your whole family, by your community, that you were such a disgrace. You were a ne'er-do-well, and we were going to send you away so that your ne'er-do-welness, if that's a word, would not be seen, could be hidden. I think that would be devastating, but then again, there's part of me that would think, send me away. and give me money every month to continue to be good for nothing. In Christianity, we distinguish between a couple ideas that I want to sort out so that this gift of the Spirit in our discussion of goodness doesn't lead us to some faulty conclusions. You saw it, and I think if you caught it in our opening hymn, the idea that God has created us, God creates all, and at the sort of the conclusion of that first creation story, after creating the heavens and the earth and all the animals and the sun and the sky and the rain, and then people, God saw what God created and said, it is good. It is a non-negotiable theological doctrine. We believe that humans are intrinsically good. That cannot be negotiated away. And so is it possible then for us to call someone a ne'er-do-well? Is it possible for us to claim that someone is a good for nothing? No. Insofar as we do not believe that people are bad at their core, but they are made in God's image, and therefore they are good. So what do we do with this whole ne'er-do-well? And that brings us to what we read today, again, in Paul's letter to the Galatians. Remember, he's starting with the phrase, by contrast, or what we read today, but. He's contrasting this with an earlier list of what I've referred to previously as the me-first attitudes and behaviors that end up being community-destroying. His list of ne'er-do-wellness, perhaps. He says, by contrast to that, the fruit of the Spirit is and goodness. Whereas the New Revised Standard Version translates it generosity. There is a fruit of the Spirit called goodness. And as I've said in a previous sermon, the idea isn't that we lack these things, these virtues, and God gives them to us, but that we are good, but God adds a sense of goodness, God's goodness, to our intrinsic goodness. And so that allows Paul, and for us, we live in the real world, to know that even though one is intrinsically good, the ethical or the moral question arises, am I good for something? Or am I good for nothing? I hope you can catch the twist I'm making. I have this reservoir within me of goodness, and do I simply poorly steward that goodness and not bring it into the world and share it so that it can yield fruit, God's goodness in the world? Or do I simply allow that goodness to remain dormant within me and use that good for nothing? So this is how we can understand in our Christian worldview that when I ask myself, am I a good for something or am I good for nothing? It can be a very convicting question, meant to get me going and thinking, how might I apply that goodness? The opposite of the remittance man in that same time period we call the self-made person. You quite often hear the phrase reduced to the self-made man, but the truth is that there are self-made men, women that were able to make something in the world from the resources that they had internally. And if on one hand, a family would look at one child and think, that ne'er-do-well, let's give them allowance, and let's send them off into the wilderness, and they'll either rise or they'll fall. Similarly, those families would say, we have this child who is so full of initiative, who has demonstrated that they have gifts that they want to use, and we'll give them an allowance, and we'll send them off to apprentice somewhere in the world, knowing that not only will their gifts be manifest where they go, but perhaps selfishly the family would say, we can then be proud to be able to boast about our child who we've sent away, who's off doing great things in the world. A ne'er-do-well and someone who is using their good for something. I tell this story to set up, again, this idea. What does it mean for us to describe a Christian as a good for nothing? And let me put it differently. What does it mean for us to describe the Christian church as good for nothing? When you imagine what that may look like, the sad news is, I believe, that it's easy for the world to look at the church and say, the church is good for nothing. And then extend from there, the church is filled with Christians who are good for nothing. You just have to turn on the news today, and you will be reminded of the ways in which the church and its Christians in it, despite having such access to good, are good for nothing. What we would call poor stewardship. There's this question, you've heard it before, that you ask congregations, if your congregation was closed tomorrow, would your community even notice? If this congregation were to be wiped off the map tomorrow, would it make a difference in the world? And the answer to that question is, depends. Are we good for something? Do we steward our goodness for something? Or are we good for nothing? Do we not steward our goodness for something in the world? We are called to be good for something. As followers of Jesus Christ, when we think about that theme I keep coming to, the idea of our spirituality, spirituality is about nurturing our capacity to be good for something in the world. What does it mean for us to be that goodness? Well, it means that as a church, when the world looks at us, they don't shake their head and say, I really wish they would get out of the way. But instead they say, I really wish that we could have that church on our side as we work towards the common good. Are we good for something, or are we ne'er-do-wells, or whatever it is? We are intrinsically, like that orange, good inside. Peel it away, how are we going to squeeze that goodness into the world so that we can sustain it? Amen.